This is Helen Eifert speaking, and this is my macroeconomics project on macroeconomic equilibrium. In this slideshow, there will be economy in the long run equilibrium, recessionary gap, inflationary gap, and stagflation. It's part of Unit 3, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, in fluctuations in outputs and prices. I give you forewarning, I have no computer and had to spend money on this iMovie app, which is terrible. And I apologize for the panning because it didn't fit to the screen, and the redundancy of this entire slideshow because it's a very general project. And without further ado, here's the rest of it. Alright, we're going to start with graphing equilibrium. In every single gap, you're going to start with long-run aggregate supply labeled LRAS, and you're going to graph that on a graph with price level on the y-axis and quantity of real GDP on the x-axis. After graphing your long-run aggregate supply line, which is vertical, you're going to graph the next two lines. Since this is not a gap and it's equilibrium, there's no particular one you need to graph first, so you're just going to graph a positive sloping line of short-run aggregate supply labeled SRAS and a negative sloping line labeled AD for aggregate demand. After graphing all three lines, you have your long-run equilibrium. You can draw two dotted lines going to the point that you're going to plot in the center of the three lines that intersect, and this is your price level equilibrium. And at the bottom, your quantity equilibrium. And so that was your long-run equilibrium, which shows the economy at full employment, which means that the unemployment is at 5% and the CPI is at 3%. And those are your two equilibrium percentages to remember for the next three gaps. Next, we're going to graph recessionary gap, which is what happens when the economy is in a recession. So again, you start with your graph labeled PL for price level and QRGDP for quantity of real GDP, and start with your vertical line of long-run aggregate supply. Next, you're going to graph the line that does not change. In this case of a recessionary gap, you're going to graph the short-run aggregate supply, which remains where it was in equilibrium, and plot your point to show where equilibrium should be, and that would be where price level and quantity equilibrium stay. Next, we're going to graph the problem line, which in a recessionary gap is the aggregate demand line. The downward sloping line moves to the left, down on the short-run aggregate supply, and then you plot your point, which is where the recessionary gap is now. Because of the leftwards shifting aggregate demand, the unemployment and CPI both change, and employment going up, anything above 5%, which is equilibrium, and CPI going down, anything below 3% equilibrium. Next, we're going to graph the inflationary gap, which you start out the same way as all the other ones, with price level PL on the y-axis and QRGDP on the x-axis, and long-run aggregate supply vertical line to always start with. Just like in the recessionary gap, the non-problem line is short-run aggregate supply, and you're going to start with that one, showing where equilibrium should be, plotting short-run aggregate supply, and then graphing the point where equilibrium should be, which is right there, pointed out by the dotted lines. Next, you graph the problem line, which, again, like the recessionary gap, is aggregate demand, only this time instead of moving it to the left, since the price level goes up in an inflation, it moves to the right. So you move the downward-facing line to the right along the short-run aggregate supply and graph your new point. And so that's the inflationary gap, and because of the rightward shift, the unemployment goes down, so anything below the 5% equilibrium, and CPI goes up, anything above the 3% equilibrium, so opposite of recessionary. The last gap we will do is the stagflationary gap, which is the worst to deal with because you have problems in both, which tends to lead to problems when you fix them, but you start the same way with the graph and the long-run aggregate supply vertical line first. The next one you do is the non-problem line, which in a stagflation, unlike inflationary and recessionary, is the aggregate demand line. So that remains the same as in equilibrium. Plot the downward sloping line and plot your point for equilibrium and where it should be. Next, you're going to plot the problem line, which in a stagflationary gap is short-run aggregate supply, again, unlike recessionary and inflationary, and this line is shifted to the left, up along the aggregate demand line, and plot your new point where stagflationary gap is. Because of the leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply line, the unemployment goes up, so anything above the 5% equilibrium, and the CPI also goes up anything above the 3% equilibrium of CPI, this creating a big problem when trying to fix these gaps because you have a trade-off as to which one is more important. And that's my project on macroeconomic equilibrium. I hope you all know how to graph some gaps.